May 12, 1945. The train hissed to a stop in the middle of nowhere, a barren siding under a washed-out American sky. Dust lifted in slow spirals as the doors creaked open. Inside, dozens of German women, most still wearing wrinkled auxiliary uniforms, blinked at the sunlight that felt too gentle for prisoners. The air smelled of coal, metal, and distant spring rain. No guard shouted. No dogs barked. Only the hum of a place that seemed almost calm. They stepped down one by one, boots crunching on gravel. Some still clutched duffel bags. Others carried nothing but a name sewn into their collar. The barbed wire of the camp gleamed ahead, clean, symmetrical, unreal. Behind it, laughter, high, pitched, unfiltered children's laughter. The women froze. They had been told the Americans hated them, that capture meant humiliation. Instead, they saw children chasing a ball beyond the fence, sunlight glinting off its rubber surface. An officer motioned them forward. Orders were simple: line up, count, silence. The women obeyed automatically. But their minds raced. Where was the rage, the spit, the revenge? This was supposed to be the enemy's victory parade, not a reception. Inside the compound, the first shock was the orderliness. Barracks stood straight, roofs tarred, windows intact. Smoke rose from a distant kitchen hut, the unmistakable scent of food. Hot food, we expected vengeance. One woman later wrote, not music. Because somewhere beyond the camp, a phonograph played faint swing tunes. As dusk rolled in, the temperature dropped. A guard walked by, tipping his cap slightly, more habit than respect, but enough to confuse every assumption they'd carried across a ruined Europe. For a brief second, one prisoner caught her reflection in the fence wire. A German uniform framed by American farmland. The war had ended, but no one knew what that meant yet. Then, from the other side, came a sound that didn't belong in war, the crinkle of paper, soft and deliberate. Small hands pushed something through the fence. The women hesitated, a candy bar, Hershey's, chocolate wrapped in silver. They didn't know whether to reach for it or turn away. Tomorrow, that single act would shatter everything they thought they knew about enemies and mercy. The morning came warm and clear, the kind of small, town sunlight that didn't belong in a war story. Inside the POW camp, the women lined up for roll call, still unsure if the candy from last night had been a mistake. The wrapper glinted in the dirt where someone had dropped it, a symbol too strange to ignore: enemy sugar in enemy soil. Near the fence, 2 American kids appeared again. A boy maybe 10, his sister a few years younger, both holding something shiny. Gum this time, bright, sweet, smelling impossibly normal. The women stood still as statues. The guard didn't stop the children. He just watched, one hand resting on his rifle, face unreadable. One of the German women, her hair braided tight under a frayed cap, took a hesitant step forward. She'd once marched through Prague and never flinched. But now, at a fence lined with kindness, she froze. The boy smiled and pushed a stick of gum through the wire. For a heartbeat, no one moved. Then she reached out. Their fingers almost touched. The gum slid through. It wasn't about sugar, it was about disbelief. This was supposed to be hatred's aftermath, not a child's mercy. The sweetness hit her tongue like shock therapy. She couldn't remember the last time she'd tasted anything that wasn't powdered, rationed, or bitter. Reports later showed Allied POW camps issued 2 500 to 3 zeros. 0 calories per day, the same ration as their own soldiers. Back home, German civilians were surviving on half that. For the prisoners, it wasn't the amount that stunned them. It was equality, fairness, procedure. That word had been twisted beyond meaning in their world. Another woman whispered, "Our own soldiers never smiled like that." Her voice cracked between guilt and wonder. Behind her, the others began murmuring, soft, uncertain laughter. The guard looked up from his post, half smiling, as if he understood the gravity of what just happened. The gum, the laughter, the fence, they blurred together into one confusing truth. The enemy wasn't playing the part they'd been warned about. That night the camp quieted early, but one woman couldn't sleep. She stared at the silver gum wrapper hidden under her pillow, wondering if kindness could taste like defeat. And when dawn came again, she wasn't thinking about home. She was thinking about that first bite of mercy. She unwrapped the candy like it was contraband. The chocolate had softened overnight in the Kansas heat, edges melting against the foil. Around her the barracks still hummed with low whispers, women debating whether to eat, share, or hide the gift. For months they'd lived on thin stews, stale bread, and fear. Sweetness was no longer a flavor, it was a memory. She broke the bar in half and handed a piece to the woman in the next bunk. The other nodded, silent thanks, eyes glistening. When she finally bit down, the sugar hit her tongue like fire. It wasn't just taste, it was time travel. Every bite dragged her back to a Germany before bombings, before propaganda, before uniforms. The last time she'd eaten chocolate was during a Christmas blackout in 1943, when her younger brother had saved a piece for her. He never came back from the Eastern Front. Outside, morning drills began, guards calling names, boots crunching gravel, sunlight cutting through wire. The candy melted faster than she could swallow. It felt like mercy and insult. She would later write. Mercy, because they were fed by their conquerors; insult, because kindness made surrender real. By May 1945, Germany's food system had collapsed. Official documents show civilians scraping by on 0 calories a day. In some cities it dropped lower. The women in this camp, thousands of miles from home, were eating better than their mothers. That knowledge sank heavier than any punishment could. She looked across the yard toward the guards' mess hall. Laughter drifted out, mixed with the smell of coffee, real coffee, not roasted barley. The sound made her heart ache. For the first time, she wondered if defeat could ever be digested. In the corner, a few prisoners knelt in silent prayer. Others just sat, holding small pieces of candy-like relics. One woman wiped tears with the back of her hand, muttering that she didn't deserve this much kindness. The sweetness had done something no rifle ever could. It had pierced through pride. And when the bell rang for rations, the smell of soup filled the air, rich, thick, unmistakably American. She rose slowly, still clutching the empty foil, wondering what else they were hiding behind that strange mercy. Steam drifted from the camp kitchen like a signal of contradiction. The smell of onions, broth, and butter rolling through the yard where enemies stood in neat lines. The women filed forward, mess tins in hand, expecting mockery or ration scraps. Instead, American soldiers ladled soup with mechanical precision, not contempt. Each bowl looked the same, fairness that was the first shock of captivity. Inside the dining hut, the noise was calm, almost domestic. Metal spoons clinked against tin. Boots scuffed on wooden floors. One woman glanced up at a Red Cross inspector moving quietly along the line, clipboard in hand, noting temperatures, cleanliness, compliance. Every detail felt rehearsed and foreign. Back home, orders had been shouted. Here, they were followed in silence. The soup was thick with lentils and meat. Some couldn't eat, others devoured every spoonful, too aware of what their families were living on across the ocean. Reports later confirmed it. Allied camps maintained around 800 calories per day for POW, by Geneva Convention standards enough to work, to live, to rebuild. Even the latrines were cleaner than what most civilians had left behind in bomb. Doubt Berlin. They fed us more than our officers ever did. One woman murmured, half in awe, half in shame. That line spread quietly across the tables. Heads nodded. For the first time, the camp wasn't a symbol of defeat. It was proof of how far their own leaders had failed them. After lunch, they were led to showers, real water pressure, real soap. The guards didn't stare, didn't jeer. Procedure again. One prisoner stared at a reflection in the mirror above the sink. Thinner, older, eyes hollow but alive. She whispered, "This is what losing feels like. Not chains, not pain, but being treated better by your enemy than your own command ever had." Later, The women hung their issued uniforms, khaki overalls marked PW, in the sun to dry. The American flag flapped gently above the compound, its rhythm oddly soothing. A guard walked past, whistling softly, not in cruelty but out of habit. It made the place feel almost unreal. Then, as dusk bled in, one of the women noticed him again, the young sergeant from yesterday, handing out letters with quiet eyes. He was young, maybe 20, for, with sunburned cheeks and sleeves rolled up to the elbow, the women had nicknamed him the Quiet Sergeant. He didn't curse, didn't stare, didn't joke. Every morning he carried a clipboard and a satchel of letters, his boots clicking against the gravel in rhythm with the camp's heartbeat. That morning the women saw him pause by their barrack door, sifting through envelopes, stamped with the red triangle of the Red Cross. He read out names in clear, neutral English. No sneer, no emphasis, just names. When one woman stepped forward, trembling, uncertain, he met her eyes and handed over the letter like a postman, not a victor. "Rules are rules," he said quietly. "Mail goes through." Then he moved on. The letter's paper was thin, the handwriting shaky. Her mother was alive. The street wasn't. The words smelled faintly of smoke and salt. She sat on her bunk, clutching it with both hands, her eyes tracing every line twice. Outside, she could hear the sergeant moving to the next hut, reading more names into the afternoon air. In 1945 alone, over 90,000 German POW in America exchanged censored letters through the Red Cross. The system worked with cold efficiency. The same logistics that had once fueled an army now maintained communication between enemies. For many prisoners, those letters were the only proof that home still existed. That night she wrote back. She kept it simple, no politics, no shame. Just, "I am safe, I eat well, I don't understand it." Her pencil shook as she wrote the last line, "They treat us like humans." She folded it carefully, sealing it with the envelope the sergeant had given her. When she handed it back the next day, he didn't smile or speak, just nodded once, as if acknowledging something unspoken between them, the kind of understanding that needed no translation. Back in the barrack, other women teased her, half curious, half envious, but the tone was lighter than it had been in months. One act of routine decency had changed the atmosphere more than any sermon could. That evening, as floodlights buzzed to life, she sat by the window, rereading her mother's letter and wondering where her words would land. The letter left Kansas wrapped in layers of military protocol, inspected, stamped, translated, delayed. Weeks later, it reached a postal depot somewhere in the British zone of occupation, then travelled by truck through a landscape of ash and silence. When it finally arrived in Hamburg, a city that once shimmered under neon and river lights, there was barely a post office left to receive it. Her mother found the envelope wedged under the door of what used to be their apartment building. Only a staircase now stood, spiraling up into smoke. The handwriting was unmistakable. Tears blurred the ink before she even opened it. The words were simple, "I am alive." "They feed us. Don't worry. It wasn't much, but it meant more than any broadcast or speech. Proof that kindness existed on the other side of the wire." Cut back to Kansas. The daughter sits by the fence that evening, staring into the distance where the sky turns violet over the prairie. The wind smells of wheat and diesel, and for the first time she feels the vastness of peace, how quiet it can be after so much noise. The sergeant walks by and tips his cap. She nods back, a gesture she'd never imagined giving to an American uniform. In Hamburg, survivors were living on less than 0 calories a day. Over 70% of housing had been destroyed. Some districts looked like moonscapes. Relief agencies rationed bread, powdered milk, and soap by the ounce. Her mother read the letter by candlelight and whispered, "Thank God the enemy remembers mercy." She folded it and kept it under a cracked teacup, the safest hiding place she knew. In Kansas the news spread. a film screening tonight in the camp hall. The guards said it was for education. The women didn't know what kind. They thought maybe it was about America, its farms, factories, smiling faces. A distraction. They were wrong. The projectors would soon replace the sound of laughter. Images would bleed across the wall that no one could unsee, and by the time the reels stopped spinning, the women would understand why kindness felt heavier than punishment. The projector rattled like a nervous machine. Dust floated through the beam as the first reel spun to life. The women sat on wooden benches, rows of grey uniforms and hollow faces. The guards stood quietly along the walls, not gloating, not explaining. The caption flashed in English, then German, the title, Buchenwald, Dachau, Bergen, Belsen. The room went silent except for the soft whir of film. Then came the images, piles of bodies, bulldozers pushing through human remains. Prisoners so thin they looked like shadows. No music, no narration, just silence and death in black and white. One woman covered her mouth, another turned away, trembling. No one had warned them. For years they had heard rumors, enemy lies. Their officers said, but this was no propaganda. It was evidence. It was truth projected larger than life, impossible to deny. An American officer's voice finally broke the silence. These are German camps. No rage. Just statement. Some women cried openly. Others stared blankly, jaws locked. A few whispered prayers. We had no idea. One finally said in a hoarse whisper, but we looked away too long. That line would echo long after the film ended. The numbers hit harder than the images. Over 11 million murdered, 6 million Jews, the rest political prisoners, Roma, dissidents. The women shifted uncomfortably, uniforms suddenly feeling like chains they hadn't noticed before. When the reels ended, the lights came up, too bright, too merciless. No one moved, even the guards stayed still, as if unsure what to say. The same sergeant who handed out letters earlier just stood at the back, head lowered. Outside, night had fallen over the camp. The women walked back in silence, their boots scraping against gravel like confession. Inside the barracks, no one spoke of revenge anymore. The war had shrunk down to faces on film, and the unbearable question, what did we know and when? Some cried until dawn. Others just stared at the fence, the same one where the candy had passed through. But now the wire reflected more than captivity. It reflected the truth that innocence and guilt had blurred long before the war had ended. And by sunrise, one woman stood at that fence again, searching for something she couldn't name. The sun rose quietly over the camp, a pale disk behind the wire. The same fence that once felt like punishment now looked different, less like a boundary, more like a reflection. On one side stood women stripped of certainty. On the other, a world that kept turning without them. She walked closer, fingers brushing the cold metal, watching her own face bend and blur between the twisted strands. Beyond the fence, the town woke slowly. Trucks rumbled down the dirt road, carrying milk, newspapers, life. Children ran past again, chasing that same rubber ball. Their laughter carried across the field, the same sound that had shattered her expectations weeks ago. But now it hurt differently, not with envy, but with longing. She had joined the auxiliary service at 19. No gun, just a typewriter and orders. We obeyed. That was our sin. She whispered. Most of the women here had never seen combat. They had written reports, bandaged soldiers, filed names. But obedience had been its own battlefield. The film they'd seen had burned that truth into them forever. In the yard, an American guard approached carrying a broom. She tensed, expecting insult. Instead, he handed it to her with a simple instruction: sweep the path, no sarcasm. No cruelty, just work, the same rule for everyone. It wasn't degradation. It was routine, structure, a way to move forward without collapsing. So she swept. The rhythmic scrape of straw on gravel steadied her breathing. Other women joined in, cleaning windows, mending clothes, trimming weeds along the barracks. For the first time, the camp felt alive, not just confined. The act of cleaning, of repairing, was almost penance, quiet, unspoken. That afternoon, She saw her reflection again in the water barrel. Sweat, dust, and something new behind her eyes. Not pride, not defiance, recognition. The war had left them hollow, but the work was starting to fill the space with something human. When the bell rang for supper, she leaned the broom against the fence and looked out again. The children had returned, one waved, the ball bouncing in the grass. She almost waved back. Almost tomorrow she thought maybe she would. And tomorrow work would become something else entirely, a bridge instead of a wall. By late June, the camp had turned into a machine of small, steady movements, sweeping, mending, planting, hauling. The women worked not as prisoners but as something in between. Accountable, tired, free within limits. Each morning began with the creak of the barrack doors and the clatter of tin buckets. They were assigned to the farms nearby, fields so wide they seemed to swallow the horizon. At first it felt like humiliation. German uniforms under American sun, hands blistered from soil they didn't own. But work has a strange gravity. It pulls shame downward and turns it into motion. Soon the rhythm of labor became its own language. One woman tended rows of beans. Another repaired torn uniforms for guards who thanked her in broken German. A third milked cows at dawn, the smell of hay and sweat cutting through the ghosts of war. Reports from the U.S. War Department estimated that POW labor between 1945 and 1946 saved American farms over $200 million during manpower shortages. The irony wasn't lost on anyone, the defeated feeding the victors. Yet something unexpected grew from that imbalance. Respect. Farmers began leaving extra apples near the work sheds. Guards loosened curfews. Civilians nodded politely when the trucks drove past. One woman later recalled, "We grew food for the people we tried to starve." That sentence spread through the barracks like a quiet confession. It carried weight. The women started taking pride in each harvested row, not for survival, but for atonement. The fence didn't seem as tall anymore. On Sundays, the guards allowed them to walk near the creek. They washed clothes, sang old songs softly in the wind. A guard once joked, "You sing better than our radio." And for a moment, everyone laughed the kind of laugh that comes when fear finally runs out of breath. Evening brought the smell of bread baking, diesel trucks idling, someone's harmonica drifting across the camp. In that music, the women felt something they hadn't dared to feel since capture, belonging. The enemy had stopped being faceless. Then, one night at roll call, a rumor swept through the ranks. Some POW were being released soon. The word freedom hung in the air like thunder before a storm. The first whisper came before dawn, passed from bunk to bunk like contraband hope. Names are posted at the gate. Someone murmured. Within minutes, the entire barrack was awake. Boots hit the floor, hands straightened uniforms, hearts thudded in unison. Outside, fog curled low over the yard as the prisoners gathered beneath the notice board, nailed to the wooden gate. A guard stood beside it, clipboard in hand, reading names aloud in alphabetical order. Each pause felt like a lifetime. Every syllable sounded like a verdict. Some women cried when their names were called, others just stood still, unable to believe that freedom could sound so plain. Those not called held their breath longer, pretending not to care, but you could feel it, the invisible tremor of disappointment rippling through the line. By 1947, nearly every German POW held in the U.S. would be repatriated, most under the Geneva Convention's structured releases. But in 1945, that future was just a rumor, for now release meant uncertainty. Home wasn't home anymore. Letters spoke of ruins, hunger, missing family. One woman whispered, "We're afraid to go home, afraid of who we'll find." Another replied, "Afraid of who we've become." The sergeant with the letter satchel stood nearby, scanning the list. His eyes softened when he saw her name wasn't there. "Maybe next week," he said quietly, She nodded, managing a faint smile that didn't reach her eyes. Around her, the air buzzed with a strange energy, joy and dread dancing together. When the crowd dispersed, the camp seemed smaller. The women left behind moved slower, their laughter thinner. The lucky ones packed their few belongings, spare socks, folded letters, an apple for the road. Trucks waited outside the gate, engines humming like impatient beasts. As the vehicles rolled away, the women inside waved through open slats, faces pressed against the wooden boards. Those staying watched until the dust settled, each secretly imagining their own name being called next. Later that afternoon, as the sun burned through the fog, she returned to the same fence, the same patch of grass where it had all begun. And standing there, as if on cue, the boy appeared again, small hand holding something shiny through the wire. The boy stood there, same striped shirt, same nervous smile, only taller now, maybe by an inch. In his hand, another candy bar. The paper shone under the sun like a peace treaty wrapped in silver. For a second, neither moved. The woman froze, one hand gripping the fence, the other trembling slightly. Months had passed since that first exchange, months of work, rumors, and quiet revelations. Yet somehow, this tiny ritual had survived the war's gravity. "He held it out for you," he said softly, accent thick but clear. She hesitated, then reached through the wire. This time, her fingers didn't stop halfway. Their fingertips brushed, just enough to feel that this wasn't about candy anymore. It was about forgiveness disguised as sweetness. Behind her, a few other women watched, smiling faintly. One muttered, "That boy will never understand what he just did." Another whispered back, "Maybe that's why it matters." Allied records show that many POW camps were built near small American towns, close enough for local families to see the prisoners working in fields, sometimes even exchanging words or gifts. Reports mention children offering fruit, letters, or candy through the fences, simple gestures that quietly rewrote the script of enemies and monsters. The guard saw the exchange but didn't interfere. He leaned against the post, pretending not to notice, but his jaw softened. The boy laughed, the easy, bubbling kind that didn't need translation, and ran off down the dusty road, leaving footprints in sunlight. She looked at the candy, unwrapped half of it, then stopped. Instead of eating, she tucked it into her pocket, same as before. Only this time, it wasn't a symbol of confusion. It was a promise that something in her had changed, maybe permanently. The other women went back to their chores, but she lingered, fingers tracing the cool metal of the fence. Beyond the wire, harvest trucks rumbled in the distance, and somewhere far off, a train whistle cut through the air, long, mournful, final. Her pulse quickened. Word spread fast. Another transport tomorrow, repatriation, Germany, the place that used to be home. She looked at the candy again and whispered, "One last taste of America." The train smelled of coal and endings. Iron wheels screamed against the tracks as it pulled through the shattered German countryside. Fields charred black, towns turned to skeletons. When the women finally stepped off, the silence hit harder than captivity ever had. No guards, no fences. Just ruins and wind. The repatriation officer checked names against a ledger, then waved them through with mechanical indifference. "You're home," he said, but home was a ghost. Streets had no doors, only holes. The air still carried the scent of ash. She clutched her small canvas bag, a few clothes, one photograph, and the uneaten candy from Kansas. The silver wrapper had worn thin, creased from every mile it had traveled. Hamburg looked worse than her imagination had prepared her for. By 1946, over 70% of its housing was gone. Tram lines hung twisted like nerves. Families lived in cellars or improvised huts made from scorched bricks. People traded bread for soap, soap for news, news for silence. Children played with rubble as toys. She walked the familiar street that no longer existed, counting steps by habit. The building where she'd grown up was gone, replaced by a crater filled with rainwater. She didn't cry she'd run out of tears in captivity. Instead, she sat on the edge of the pit and unwrapped the candy. Its surface had softened, edges cracked, the smell faint but real. Around her, women in patched coats passed quietly, each face a different story of loss. None looked surprised to see a former uniform among them. In this wasteland, identity didn't matter, survival did. She broke the candy in two, offering half to a small boy watching her from across the rubble. He looked no older than the American child who'd once done the same for her. She smiled and placed the candy on a small stone near him. Only then did she notice the grave marker, wooden, crude, bearing a child's name and the year 1945. The boy was gone, the grave remained. She knelt, pressing the silver wrapper flat against the earth like an offering. "We left the camp richer than our country," she whispered. The wind lifted the foil, flickering light across the cratered street. And when she looked up, the horizon glowed faintly, not with fire, but with the first fragile dawn of peace. Years later, in a small rebuilt apartment near Bremen, she sat at a kitchen table with her daughter, sunlight filtering through lace curtains, the city alive again with factory smoke and bicycle bells. The war was a memory carved deep, but fading at the edges. On the table lay a worn Bible and between its pages a crinkled silver wrapper, the same one that had crossed oceans, fences, and graves. Her daughter was 8, hair tied with a ribbon, eyes full of that same innocent curiosity that once stared at her from the other side of barbed wire. "Mama, why do you keep that old paper?" she asked. The woman smiled faintly, tracing the edges with her fingertip. "Because," she said, "it reminds me that kindness can survive anything." She told her the story in pieces, not of armies or orders, but of small things. A boy at a fence, a piece of candy, a guard who didn't spit. She left out the camps, the hunger, the shame. What mattered wasn't the war itself, but how it ended, not with bullets, but with gestures so small they barely seemed real. Post-war surveys later confirmed what her story already proved. Nearly 70% of German POW described their Allied treatment as fair or humane. Historians would write about logistics, ideology, reconstruction, but they would miss what she had learned firsthand. Mercy can be a weapon too, and it leaves no scars you can see. Her daughter listened, died imagining the candy wrapper glinting under an American sun. "Did you eat it?" she asked. The woman laughed softly. "No," she said. "It wasn't mine to eat. It was mine to remember." Outside, church bells rang ordinary, living sounds. The woman looked out the window at children playing in the street, the same laughter that had once echoed beyond the camp fence. She felt something close to peace, maybe forgiveness. "They beat us with kindness," she said quietly, almost to herself. That's how they won. Her daughter didn't fully understand, but one day she would, when history stopped being numbers and became stories like this one. And as the light caught the old silver foil, it shimmered, a relic of a war lost and a humanity regained.